I am honored and privileged to call upon Professor Ziv Gil to introduce our distinguished lecturer of this morning, Professor Michael Tuttle.
Tuttle is a famous rabbi in Israel, so they confuse you with him sometimes. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Mike Tuttle. Dr. Tuttle is a professor of medicine and endocrinology at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Lieutenant Mike Tuttle started his career as an army doctor, and after finishing his residency, he was recruited to the endocrinology service at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Since then, he dedicated his life to the treatment of thyroid cancer patients. Working with the NIH and leading the Endocrine Thyroid Association, the American Thyroid Association, he managed to change the way we think about thyroid cancer and reshape the way we treat patients nowadays. Just to give you an example, the ATA guidelines of 2015 was leaked out from the committee and now is considered the standard of care even before it was published. I think Dr. Tuttle is the second most prominent name in the field after the thyroid himself. Mike trained numerous endocrinologists, but more than that, he trained numerous head and neck surgeons, and I had the privilege to be one of his trainees. Dr. Tuttle is going to speak about an issue which is close to us, the influence of radiation on thyroid cancer. Dr. Tuttle, please.
Good morning. Oh, no problem. It's working out just fine. This feels very much like Grand Rounds in New York, so I'm feeling very much at home, although you're very early. Nobody in New York shows up for another 15 or 20 minutes, so it's an absolute honor to be here. This is my first time in Israel. My wife and I have been here for a week. My wife has no intention of going back home with me tonight. She loves the weather, and we have had an absolute wonderful time. So thank you for your hospitality. This morning's talk is going to be a little different than the typical Grand Rounds talk that a lot of times has lots of data and lots of energy. This is more a sort of a historical talk. I will tell you I have several biases. The story is going to be about radiation. My main bias is it's going to be related to thyroid. And when I'm done, you're going to think that the only thing that radiation bothers in the entire body is the thyroid. That's a different one. There you go. You're going to think that the only thing that radiation bothers is the thyroid. Secondarily, they only have 45 minutes to tell you a history of a couple hundred years, so by necessity, I'm going to leave things out. And thirdly, without a doubt, I'm going to tell this from an American perspective, because I happen to be American, despite all the travels. I've had good fortune to visit most of the places I'm going to show you about because I've been interested in how radiation causes thyroid cancer for many, many years. So I've had the privilege of being in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and that one right there, we are perfect. Make that one open, perfect. As well as around a lot of nuclear power plants. Many of the patients that have been exposed to radiation seek me out in New York, so I've had the good opportunity to visit several of these places. So what I'm going to try to give you is sort of a historical perspective. And it's a cross-section between science, it's a cross-section between politics, it's a cross-section between us that I think is still very relevant as we think about accidents that happen and atomic weapons and those sorts of things. So this is going to be a very relaxed, sort of easy talk. So our story actually starts in 1895. With Conrad Roentgen, who actually discovered X-rays. Back at the time, they were playing with cathode ray tubes, and when you turn the battery on in the cathode ray tubes, you get this glow. But one of the things that Dr. Roentgen did was he figured out that if he put a box over top of the cathode ray tube and turned on the cathode ray, he actually would make things glow on his bench. This was purely a serendipitous accident because he was just trying to cover up and say, can you see the light? And if you block the light, what happens? and there happened to be a fluorescent subject on his bench where there was a lot of things. And when he would turn the power on and off, when he turned the power on, obviously there was some rays coming out of this box that he described as X-rays. And when he would turn it on, you would get this glow from the fluorescent substance, and he would turn it off. And then, like good scientists, he began putting lots of stuff between the source of the radiation and the green glow to see where you could block it. The most famous was his wife's hands, which shows it's never good to be married to a scientist, because this is actually his wife's hand that showed that in this upper corner here, that the bones would actually block the X-rays, and so you could see the X-rays there. And this led to his Nobel Prize in Physics just a few years later in 1901. Now, it began to be very quickly used, and there are reports of X-rays being used in England less than 3 or 4 months later, with the first classic report of somebody doing an X-ray of a hand that had a needle in it, and then quickly let out. Now, in the United States, you know we're going to do some things with it, so it seemed good to try to figure out to take pictures of feet in Boston. So this is an X-ray of a shoe in Boston. This happens to be my favorite. This was published as the first X-ray of a brain in the skull. What's wrong with this picture? Can you really see the brain inside a skull? Yeah, so this was faked. This was catgut stuffed with barium and published as the first X-ray of the brain. So these early studies, not everything that came out was really true. Within less than a year, there were lots of people doing X-rays for medical reasons. Now, this is probably not the best way to do an X-ray on your patient, because the radiation source is here, the patient is here, and the doctor is here. If you plan on living long and not getting bad disease, apparently that's not how we do X-rays in Israel anymore, right? There's a way we do this, but they did lots of pictures this way. Anybody recognize what this machine is? Did you have these in Israel? These were very common machines in shoe stores in the United States in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, because if you wanted to see whether or not your shoes would fit appropriately, this fluoroscope was actually in the fitting rooms of the stores, and you could go into the stores, put your feet into the machine, and then look down. This was also called a babysitter, because the children would play with this machine and take X-rays of their hands and feet while mom was shopping in the back of the store. And you could still find these machines up until the 1960s in the United States. Not our best use. X-rays became very powerful. And so if you look back through the history, everything got labeled as X-rays, from headache tablets to furniture polish to X-ray soap. And so this commercialization of the X-rays, and you'll see it later with the atomic bombs as well, leaked over into politics and leaked over into our society as we began to use it. Now, the history here moves very quickly, because in less than 6 months after the discovery of X-rays, Henry Becquerel discovered natural radiation. So I'd showed you the cathode ray tube. When you energized that, it would give off X-rays. But there are other radioactive substances that give off X-rays all the time, and it was this original pitch blende that really was a source of uranium, but mostly radium. And this is what led to the fame of Marie Curie. Madame Curie actually isolated radium and then was coined this term radioactivity. It was the natural radioactivity of this pitch blende. And for many years, radium became our main source of radiation. And there were many patients treated for a variety of diseases that radium was their source. And in fact, there are early stories of Marie Curie coming to Memorial Sloan Kettering in the 1920s and actually bringing us radium that we stored and used. So she traveled the world providing all kinds of radium to various places. Now, if you look at what we were treating with radium back in the 1910s and 1920s, it was the whole variety of stuff. Remember, this is in the days before antibiotics. This is in the days before lots of pills. We didn't have a lot of good therapies, and you can see the wide variety of things that were being treated. It was also placed in the water. Very commonly, you could still find these water that actually truly had low doses of radium, because it was thought to be a good, healthy product. You could buy it at the stores, and because in the United States we think everything should be in beer, you can actually buy radium in beer. And this was very popular in the 1940s up until the 1950s. We put it in butter, we put it in cigars, and perhaps my favorite is it was put in contraceptives. So this has got to be good for preventing pregnancy. So these were all radium products. But the story's not all cheery, because the most famous trouble with radium came from this watch dial factory in New Jersey, because they developed glow-in-the-dark paints. So if you put a little bit of radium that gives off the radiation with the fluorescent paint, then that will make the fluorescent paint glow, and you could find for the first time watches that glowed in the dark. The trouble was they were also giving off radiation. So if you put an X-ray film over top of the watch, it was giving off radiation. And it turns out the way they were painting these dials, the painters would lick the tips of their paint brushes to make them very sharp pointed, put that in the radium paint, and then paint the dials. And this company actually developed in the 1920s severe radiation sickness and radiation illness from these watch dial painters that got radiation exposed from the radium, and the company actually went bankrupt. Well, the story moved on, so by the 1898s, we had isolated radium, and it was being used very commonly. And by 1934, Marie Curie's daughter and son-in-law began to develop radioactive isotopes. It also teaches us lesson number 2. Be nice to your mother-in-law until you figure out she's going to win a Nobel Prize. So that's really critical. Know who the family is. But in Marie Curie's lab, what they did was they bombarded lots of products. And they actually successfully, essentially did alchemy. They would bombard one element into another, creating radioactive nitrogen from boron, phosphorus from aluminum, silicon from magnesium. So they were actually transforming elements in the lab, many of which were very short-lived, but many of which were very radioactive. Now, the story really comes up to 1936. And in one of the early multidisciplinary meetings that there ever was, the story goes that at Harvard and MIT and Boston, once a month or once a week, the whole faculty would get together, which would include physicists and clinicians and all kinds of different groups, and they would have just generalized discussions, pretty much telling each other how smart they were, I think. But during one of those discussions, it became clear that there was radioactivity, and one of the clinicians asked the physicist, can you make radioactive iodine? Because remember, by the 1930s, we understood the iodine concentrated in the thyroid. There were rabbit studies that showed that there was thyroid hormone in the thyroid. It contained iodine, and they said if we had radioactive iodine, we could do tracer studies. We could do in vivo studies. And the story is that the Mass General doctors went back, and sure enough, over a few weeks, were able to actually synthesize various forms of radioactive iodine on the cyclotrons. And that led in 1936 to a series of important experiments where they showed that they could make the rabbits' thyroids concentrate radioactive iodine. There were early stories of studying radioactive hyperthyroid cats. Do you have those? There are cats that develop hyperthyroidism. And in New York, we actually have veterinarians that treat cats with radioactive iodine. We can't afford health care anymore, but we can treat cats with radioactive iodine. It's amazing. If you look at what happened, by 1941, so less than 5 years later, we were actually treating patients with Graves' disease and thyroid cancer with radioactive iodine. An amazingly fast process. Can you imagine how long this would take us today to get this through the FDA and approval? You couldn't get this through my review committee in 5 years, and they are actually giving this to patients. Now, it was still a problem in 1941 because the radioactive iodines were not pure. It was a combination of I-130, I-127, I-128, because they were being made on cyclotrons. But as I'll show you in a few minutes, by 1946, the U.S. had developed nuclear reactors. And one of the byproducts of nuclear reactors, when you divide uranium, is actually I-131. So by 1946, we had an abundant supply of I-131 that we could use for medical issues and for medical causes. And that really revolutionized the way we treated thyroid cancer and the way we treated Graves' disease and that sort of stuff. So again, an amazing story over 35 years or so, where you go from theoretically just incidentally discovering X-rays to finding natural radiation to the development of radioactive isotopes. And I can't imagine being a clinician practicing in 1910, 1920, and 1930, going from what felt like the Dark Ages to having x-rays, to having radioactivity, to having radium to treat cancer. That had to be a phenomenal time to be living through that episode. Now, as I mentioned, we used the x-rays to treat a lot of things. Do you know what we treated with radiation? What did we treat? Any idea? Acne. Did it work? Sure. It just had a few side effects. What else did we treat? What else did we treat? Quickly. I have a plane tonight. Yeah, exactly. So the variety of stuff that we treated was amazing. Remember, we had x-rays so we could find out that babies had enlarged thymuses. So we thought that was a problem, so we treated the thymuses. Tonsillitis, cervical adenitis. Most of the people in this room aren't old enough to remember children dying of tonsillitis, and your precursors were doing mastoids for infections and tumor that all completely went away with antibiotics. But in the days before antibiotics, we had children dying of ear infections and mastoiditis. It was a terrible disease. Treated that bronchitis, tinea capitis, the classic Israeli story of treating the tinea capitis as people returned to Israel. Acne, eustachian tubes. Do you have divers? Do you guys dive here? Scuba divers? You know how your ears get plugged up? The Navy figured out how to fix that. You put a little bit of radium on a Q-tip and put it up your nose for a few minutes. It will open up the eustachian tube. The Air Force, not to be undone, said if it works for the Navy, it'll work for the Air Force. So if you're flying to the States later on, you can use radium to open up the eustachian tubes. It worked. This became very, very common and obviously revolutionized the treatment of cancer care. Memorial was one of the early hospitals to use radiation in cancer care, and it was actually given by our surgeons, because cancer was traditionally a surgical issue, and the early radiation oncologist at Memorial was actually Jayton Shaw and Elliot Strong, and they were the surgeons that were using the external beam radiation. Well, that went along for many years, and then in another sort of multidisciplinary report that's become quite famous is Duffy and Fitzgerald, a pediatrician and a pathologist at Memorial, made the observation that they had seen 28 kids with thyroid cancer, 10 of which had been exposed to radiation. Now, today this doesn't seem like such a great observation, but it's a little bit like if I came in and told you that the microwave that you heat your coffee caused leukemia. We know that's all not possible, right? If you look in the radiation history for the thyroid was always called a radiation-resistant organ. Nobody believed that radiation could bother the thyroid at all. So the fact that these folks took this history of what was not considered to be a risk factor at all and then tried to convince the world that it was a risk factor is really a lesson for all of us. We all take the known risk factor history. These guys were asking the unknown risk factor history. They weren't all that brave because their conclusions said, maybe it's caused by radiation. They get a lot of credit, but they were smart enough not to be crucified. They were a little circumspect. But this was the first observation that said maybe radiation during childhood is a bad thing. And that led to multiple studies that showed, in fact, we had caused a lot of thyroid cancer by treating tonsils, by treating acne, primarily in young kids. It was our first observation that the adult thyroid was really resistant to radiation. It's hard to cause thyroid cancer in an adult thyroid. It's much easier to cause thyroid cancer in a child's thyroid, especially if they're less than 4 or 5 years old. And in our early treatments, that's mainly who we were treating for tonsillitis and acne and those variety of things. Now, we've learned by the mid-1970s that, in fact, radiation was a bad thing. And if you think about that, that's not all that long ago. There were still places in the United States treating acne and treating tonsils with radiation up until the 1960s. So it really was the 1970s when the NIH did a big publicity tour. They did notes to physicians and clinicians. For your young people, there was no internet back then. They actually had to mail us stuff. You'd actually have to go to a meeting. I know, I just got this blank look, like what's life before MTV and life before the internet? How could you get this message out to all the doctors in the United States? It's easy now. You go to whatever your program is. Back then was more of a challenge. These observations have held true through all of the radiation stories that it's almost always papillary thyroid cancer. We don't see medullary, we don't see anaplasty. It's always the youngest people at the time of the exposure that cause the problem. There is a definite dose-response relationship. The latency is often 10 or 20 years. It really makes that Fitzgerald observation astounding, that they were looking at some event that they were treated with 10 years ago. As we're seeing this rise in thyroid cancer now, both in the United States and all over the world, the challenge to us today is how do we identify the risk factor? Because almost surely the risk factor is going to be something that we did to our kids when they were 4 or 5, and now we're 20 years later trying to figure out what that risk factor was. It's going to be a challenge. The good news is the behavior of thyroid cancer is very similar. It doesn't matter whether it's radiation related, it doesn't matter whether it's sporadic. The molecular profiles are a little bit different, but the biologic behavior is the same. The Chernobyl pediatric thyroid cancer cases behave just like the sporadic cases I was seeing in the United States. Quiz number 2. Anybody recognize this? What is this? Bikini Island, not bad for a surgeon. That's good. You're in the right hemisphere. It's an atomic bomb. Well, yeah, it was the very first detonation. So we set this off in the US desert, so we decided not to call it a bomb, but that's essentially what it was. So this was the very beginning of the atomic age. This was the first nuclear weapon set off. I've showed this all over the world, and I showed this about 10 years ago, and somebody said that this, in fact, was a mammogram. And in fact, not only was it a mammogram, there was an abnormality right there on the mammogram. So I gave them credit for that and said, yeah, that works fine. Now, to think about how did we get there? How did we go from theoretical physics to this huge detonation in the southwest desert of the United States that fortunately didn't light our entire atmosphere on fire, and we're still here to talk about it? This story is also an amazing story that I'll compress down to 3 or 4 minutes, and you really have to intertwine it in the history of the time. The United States spent what in today's money would be billions and billions of dollars to develop the atomic weapons and a nuclear reactor. Why was that? Well, it really started, you have to go back to where we were in the 1930s. Hitler became chancellor in 1933. One of the main things that helped the atomic weapons development in both Britain and the United States was the phenomenal talent and physicians that had to leave Germany. Many of those people won Nobel Prizes in the United States, and many historians say the biggest thing that happened from Germany to help the United States and Britain develop this phenomenal technology was having all the academics leave that weren't German. They did, and then in 1938, the atom was split for the very first time. The very first time an atom was split. Do you know where that happened? Any idea where that happened? It wasn't the United States, it wasn't Israel, it was in Berlin. The physicist instantly understood, as soon as that was published, Niels Bohr, who had written sort of, you guys know the atomic theory and the shells of the electrons and neutrons and protons, Bohr had sort of developed that. And as soon as he heard that this atom had been split, he instantly recognized what had happened. His model explained that very well. Now remember, Einstein had already explained E equals mc squared. So the physicists were fully aware that when you split an atom, that little bit of mass that you lose when you split the atom turns into energy because you multiply that little bit of mass by the speed of light squared. So very, very small changes in mass when you split the atom result in tremendous amounts of energy. And there's long stories where the physicist in the United States went to Einstein, who at that time was living in Long Island in New York, and said, you have got to go talk to the US government because Germany has the ability to split the atom, they have the ability to develop an atomic weapon, and we have no doubt that they would use it if it was there. That was sort of ignored. Einstein did send a letter to FDR. Not much happened until Germany invaded Poland, and then the next month FDR funded the Manhattan Project, which was the code name for the development of atomic weapons. So that's the backdrop of how we got there. It's an amazing time because the theoretical physicist understood what this meant. The letter that Einstein sent to FDR said that we have the capability of developing a bomb that would not only destroy the ship in the harbor, but would destroy the harbor and the land surrounding the harbor. This is like a weapon that nobody had ever seen before. And they put together the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project took scientists out of all of the big universities in the United States, Columbia, Chicago, Harvard, everywhere, and centralized them into one place. They weren't allowed to know what they were doing. They would come to your lab and said, basically, the government needs you, come work. They had to leave their families, and they were brought in to work together, some of the most famous scientists in the world whose names we all know now, from Oppenheimer to Feynman to Enrico Fermi. These guys went from theoretical physics to developing the first nuclear chain reaction. So the project was funded in 1939, and by 1942, they had the first rudimentary nuclear reaction, nuclear plant running. Do you know where we decided to build our first nuclear plant? Any idea where? Yeah, Soldier Field in Chicago. So apparently the people in New York didn't think Chicago was all that valuable. So we thought, let's just put the nuclear reactor in Chicago. There was a handball court underneath the football field in Chicago. And so there are stories of sneaking in the various uranium that they could find and the bricks and everything they needed. And Enrico Fermi developed the first nuclear reactor underneath the stands in Chicago in December 1942. Now, they didn't mess around. If you think about this, the nuclear plants that were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and up in Hanford, Washington State, they were built as full-scale models. There were no mock-ups on the lab bench. There was no intermediate. And many times they would start building these buildings, and the physicists would come back to them and say, nope, we need an extra 100 meters, or we need an extra whatever. And so they were constantly being rebuilt. They built two different types of platforms, one uranium and one plutonium, because the physicists weren't sure which one would actually work for a bomb, which ones they could actually develop. So there was this huge race going on. And again, if you look at the timeline, the first sustained reaction was in 1942, the reactors opened in 43 and 44, and the weapons were actually used in 1945. It was a very big race, a very timeline that went on. And the first weapon obviously was used in Hiroshima, Japan, the famous Enola Gay, the little boy bomb that was destroyed. Hiroshima basically sat in a plain, a flat area of Japan. They detonated the bomb several hundred meters off the ground so that they didn't get fallout. So basically this was just a big burst of radiation and heat. Hiroshima was largely a town of wooden buildings, and it essentially incinerated in minutes. 3 days later, they bombed Nagasaki, Japan. Nagasaki is different. Nagasaki is a bowl. It's a crater. The bomb was set off just inside the crater, where basically everything inside the crater was destroyed, but nothing on the outside of the crater was destroyed. And there was little fallout, but again, total devastation that led to the end of the war. These patients have been studied now for many, many years, first by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and then the RERF, joint sort of worldwide groups looking at what happened to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's been over about 200,000 of these patients followed. The first thing they found was an increase in leukemia, which is not surprising, because in both of these bombs, it was like being exposed to massive X-rays. There was very little fallout because they set the bombs off so high above the earth. It was basically people within line of sight developed the leukemia. But over the years, a wide variety of solid tumors, including thyroid cancer, have developed in these folks. So clearly a group that feels very similar to the external beam radiation. Well, today there certainly is concern of use of atomic weapons, but now more and more we're concerned about nuclear power plants. So this is the nuclear power plants as of about 10 years ago, scattered throughout the world. And I think you guys don't have a nuclear power plant, but you've got 1 or 2 reactors, theoretically, secret. Okay, I don't know they're there. We don't know. That's pretty good. Yeah, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. I hope I didn't let out a secret, okay, because I'll let you know the rest of the world knows, okay? Just a little secret here. So while you don't have nuclear reactors, many countries do have research reactors and those sorts of things. In the States, we have a lot of reactors. France do, and we'll talk about Japan over there in a minute. Now, what the heck is a nuclear reactor? So you can certainly use radiation, you can use the dividing of the uranium to make huge explosions, but if you use it in a more controlled fashion, you just have the world's most expensive hot water heater. And that's essentially what a nuclear power plant is. It boils water. And it's a controlled reaction where you hit usually uranium with a neutron, that breaks up, the atom splits, it gives off just a little bit of heat, it gives off another neutron which hits another uranium particle, and this is the chain reaction. If you do this very rapidly and hold everything together, you get a huge explosion. If you do this under controlled situations, you get just the generation of heat, and that generation of heat essentially boils water here in the nuclear reactor that then runs a steam turbine. Everybody thinks these big towers that you see are the nuclear reactor. They're not. They're the cooling factory, because nuclear power plants can essentially never be turned off. You can turn them on to low, but you can't turn them off, which is going to be a problem in Chernobyl and Fukushima. So as the water boils, then it turns the turbine, and then you have to get the water back into the liquid form. It dissipates over here and then comes back into the nuclear reactor. So a nuclear reactor generates electricity, but it also uses electricity from the grid. And so as you begin to think about what happens, when you split the atom, I used to think the atom just divided into two nice little pieces. Turns out it divides into hundreds of pieces, but you get two big peaks, and that second big peak actually turns out to have radioactive iodine. And that radioactive iodine is where we get interested in the thyroid. It also is close to cesium, and you guys have seen maps after atomic bombs or radioactive fallout where they map the cesium in the soil, and because it's got a very long half-life, and you can map that as the trail, and it approximates the radioactive iodine. For the older people in the room, you remember strontium? There were old studies in the United States where the United States government, probably unlike the Israeli government, the United States government would occasionally lie to us. And they didn't sort of share that we were setting off nuclear weapons out west. And there were people on the East Coast that were collecting teeth and bone and measuring strontium and showing that our children had strontium in their teeth. There were people, Lessman Middlesworth from Tennessee, would actually collect thyroid from deers. When the hunters would collect deers, Les could map when there was a radioactive explosion several weeks before because it would float over the United States. So they would map these things out. Now, radioactive iodine is a problem for us because radioactive iodine goes up in the cloud from an accident or from a nuclear weapon. It then gets rained out into the grass, and then the cattle or the goats eat the grass, and they concentrate iodine into their milk because we need iodine in the milk for the babies. So the physicists refer to cows as nuclear concentrators. And after Chernobyl, they didn't take the cattle away for more than a day or so. So all the radioactive iodine that went into the grass was eaten by the cattle. In the Chernobyl area, there were no milk factories. People were eating and drinking directly out of the cattle. And so that's why the kids around Chernobyl got a significant dose of radiation. In addition, they were iodine deficient. So the iodine that was there, they were concentrating even more, which created a unique situation there. So the Chernobyl complex is probably the nuclear accident that's gotten the most attention for good reason. Most of these nuclear power plants have 3 or 4 or sometimes 6 reactors on the same site that they run at various times and cycle back and forth. This one happens to sit right in the corner of these 3 countries, right where Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine meet each other. In the very northern aspect of Ukraine is where the Chernobyl reactor sat. It was right beside a town called Pripyat. Pripyat was where all the workers from Chernobyl, it was a kilometer or so from Chernobyl. It's where all the workers and their family worked. It was a very typical Ukrainian Russian town. And things were going well until April 26, 1986. You can find a whole variety of stories about why the Chernobyl accident happened. The most common story is that one of the pumps that was designed to pump water into the reactor, there were actually 2 or 3 of them. One of them had malfunctioned. One of them was taken down for repair. And then the third one, they decided to find out if they turned the electricity off to that pump, what would happen. Because it's a closed system. And so the theory was if you turn the electricity off, there should be enough inertia that the water would keep pumping through for a while. And that was probably true if at least 2 of the pumps were on. When they turned the third pump off, they were unaware that the first 2 pumps were offline. When they turned it off, do you have any idea how long it was between the time they turned it off and the time the reactor exploded? Somewhere around 60 seconds. It was a huge, rapid explosion. So they lost water to the reactor overheated, went critical, and exploded the top of the reactor core. The Russian reactors don't have a separate big encampment vessel, so it was open to the environment. And the radiation cloud began to go up north and west across cities like Belarus and Minsk and Obninsk, very heavily contaminating that area, and then later on up into Europe at much lower doses. There are tremendous stories of heroic responses of the physicists and the firefighters and the people that lived in Pripyat rushing to the nuclear power plant. Now, this is often told as these poor people didn't know any better. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Pripyat was a radiation town. Their dads and moms were physicists and reactor workers. They knew exactly what they were getting into. But they were heroic stories of helicopter pilots flying in, trying to put the fire out, because the nuclear core was actually open to the environment. And unlike a nuclear bomb where you had one big explosion, this was a fire that for days continued to pour radioactive elements out into the environment. They covered it with sand, they covered it with concrete, they dumped beryllium, neutrons in there. And many of these helicopter pilots developed leukemia. Many of them developed radiation sickness as they were trying to contain this accident, but eventually over 4 or 5 days got the reactor core covered. If you looked at what happened, it depends on who tells the story. It's really hard to get a good feel for how many deaths there were and what happened in the cleanup workers, because Russia at that time wasn't really forthcoming with a lot of this information. The best we can find out is that there were about 134 people working at the plant at the time of the accident. About 28 of those died of what was probably acute radiation injury, just big doses of radiation where you die within a week or 2. A few more died later on. There were no deaths outside the plant because it seemed to be contained there. It was the fallout that was the problem. Then they had thousands and thousands of cleanup workers come in and clean up the radiation, some with radiation safety, some with not, and there are long stories about some of those passing, some of those being transferred other places. From our story, the story that really came out of Chernobyl, despite all of that radiation fallout, there really hasn't been a lot of cancers. There certainly has been thyroid cancer and there's been some leukemia, but nowhere near the incidence of other cancers as we saw from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, primarily because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were that intense X-rays, and this is the radioactive fallout over a wide range. The best we can tell, there's been about 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer after the Chernobyl accident. That compared in that region with about 300 or 400 before the accident. This is a tremendous rise in thyroid cancer, and as you would expect, the vast majority happened in the most contaminated areas and almost always in the very youngest. So you guys probably still see patients that were living in Ukraine and living in Belarus and Russia because there were big Jewish populations there that come back. The adults always want to know, am I getting thyroid cancer? I was 30 years old at the time of the accident. And the answer is generally no. That the adults that were living there, they have a statistically slight increased risk of thyroid cancer, but nowhere near what the 5-year-olds and the 10-year-olds have. So largely the adults, I'm fairly reassuring that they'll be fine. Now, the most recent one here is in Fukushima. So Japan is very heavily dependent on atomic reactors for their power. And this happened at the Fukushima site. Like most of these, there are 6 reactors in Fukushima. This is what it looked like before, sitting right on the sea. As I mentioned, all of these nuclear power plants are located either by seas or by oceans or big rivers. They need a tremendous input of water. So no matter where you find a nuclear reactor, you can pretty much bet it's going to be on a river, it's going to be on a big body of water. And so in Japan, they went on the coast. Now, what happened was when the earthquake happened, the reactors at Daiichi actually shut down. They responded the way they were supposed to. That when the earthquake happened, there are automatic systems that the control rods in Japan come from the bottom up into the core. The control rods came into the core and shut off the nuclear reactors. But as I mentioned, you don't really turn a nuclear reactor off. You turn it down really, really low. So they scrammed the reactors. That part worked just fine, and everything was going well for a bit until the tsunami hit the coast. When the tsunami hit the coast, it breached their 10-foot wall and flooded the bottoms of their power plants. And that's where the generators were. And they lost their generator power. Some of them the first day, some of them the second day. Some of these had battery backups, and the battery backups were designed to last for 8 to 12 hours because everybody figured within 8 to 12 hours, this is Japan, you would be able to get generators in, you would be able to get something in. That made total sense. But now we know after these big environmental accidents like this, it's impossible to get things in. And so what happened was they lost power. They lost the ability to put water into these reactors. And just similar to what happened in Chernobyl, although not exactly, the water into the reactor began to decline. It got too hot. The water in the reactor then turned into steam. When you expose the actual rods that have the uranium, they have a zirconium cladding on them. And that zirconium cladding, when it's exposed to air, gives off hydrogen. And so what they actually had was a hydrogen explosion. This was not a nuclear reaction. It was not a nuclear bomb. They had a hydrogen explosion inside the building. They vented the hydrogen out of the nuclear reactor. The building was supposed to be self-contained, but when the building got too much hydrogen in it, that's where the explosion came from. So unlike Chernobyl, where you had an open core, this was still radiation, but was a different amount. And this is what the hydrogen explosion looked like. The top of the buildings are essentially just blown off. The core is still intact. Now, when they overheated at least 2 or 3 of the buildings, the core did melt through the bottom of their containment vessel into the concrete. Nobody knows what happened to that, but it's there. Fortunately, at the time of the accident, most of the winds were blowing out into the ocean, and so most of the radiation that first 12 or 18 hours was taken out in the ocean. Some did go over into the population of Fukushima. The Japanese, because they are really experts at radiation and radiation safety, did their best to clear the area. Now, as we found out when I was in New York on September 11th, and in New York when we had the blackouts, there is no clearing those areas when a big disaster like that happens. The traffic just gets all blocked in. So they were kind of sheltering in place. But what they did is they prevented any of the milk from leaving the area. They prevented any of the vegetables from leaving the area. So they contained the radiation right there to Fukushima, as opposed to Russia where they just let everything go out of there. So it was a much more contained event. If you look at what happened, there was some radiation, a little bit around Japan. And of course, the U.S. always worries about themselves. So when you look at what happened, I'm just honest, that's what we do. So we're like, yeah, there was a bad accident in Fukushima. What happened in California? So I had probably half a dozen emails from California saying, do you have iodine pills you can ship me across the country? Because the pharmacies were all emptied of iodine pills. I said yes, because I've got a big bottle on my desk, and I was selling them for like $1,000 a piece. It supported my research for 6 months. If you look at what happened with the release, 3 Mile Island was a small release in the United States that everybody got excited about and was no big deal whatsoever. Wind scale was in England. This is the Fukushima at 4 to 5 million curies of radioactive iodine, huge, but nowhere near what Chernobyl was at 40 to 50 million. So we think in all likelihood, John Boyce, who's probably one of the world's experts at fallout and radiation, very solid guy in the United States. We think in all likelihood we're going to see a few cases of childhood thyroid cancer after Fukushima in the people that were immediately involved. The Japanese government is screening everybody in that area. They're doing screening ultrasounds. We tried to talk them out of it. We couldn't talk them out of it. So they're going to find a few cases of thyroid cancer and probably not much else for right now. Now, what about protecting the thyroid? So I've largely talked about the thyroid, but clearly in the event of an atomic accident or a nuclear weapon, there's a lot more to worry about except your thyroid. So largely we want to shelter. The days of trying to escape and evacuate, we've learned from big mass casualty events, it just doesn't happen. There's no way I'm getting out of Manhattan. I can barely get out of Manhattan on a good day. There's no way I'm getting out of Manhattan after 9/11 or after the blackout. So largely we say shelter in place, evacuate if you can. The real key for a population is avoiding contaminated foods. Stop that supply of milk from being shipped all over the country. Don't ship the vegetables all over the country, and keep that radiation contained in the area where it is. And the other thing that clearly works is iodine prophylaxis. Because if you take normal iodine, cold iodine, you can saturate the thyroid so that when you're exposed to radioactive iodine, it doesn't get into the thyroid. The trouble is you have to take it within an hour or two of the accident. You don't have time to go to the pharmacy. You don't have time to go everywhere. And that's where it looks like. So you can buy it in the United States. The medical people carry it around on their keychains and that sort of stuff. So what I hope I've sort of given you a flavor of this morning is sort of the amazing history of starting from X-rays to finding natural radioactivity, to radioactive iodine elements that in about a 30 or 40 year period transformed how we treat patients, to give us X-rays, to give us radioactive iodine tracers, and how that story was really intervened in the history of what was going on at the time to help us understand the place of science in politics and history. Thank you very much.